some old things before we start, old issues. It begins, the play, with the ambiguity of asking, where am I? So in a way, the issue is simple. What does it mean to know where? What does it mean to Oedipus? Now, the two alternatives we're given seem to have to do with the first line. Child of blind old man, Antigone, to what lands, Koroi, have we come, or what city of city of men? So, on the one hand, place, on the other hand, people. Now, this leads in turn to the tension between Athens and Colonus. Oedipus and Antigone have actually come to both of them, and we get alternate answers to Oedipus's question. So we come to see, although interestingly, not in the text itself, you would have to know this, of course they would know it in the audience, that at the moment when this play is supposed to be taking place, the king, Theseus, is engaged in the attempt to unify under one government a bunch of littler cities that identify themselves with their own places. So the puzzle is this: how do you preserve loyalty to a particular city while undermining the identification of place to city? That's what Theseus has to do. He has to pull them away from their identification, the Colonians, their identification with Colonus on the one hand, and reattach them to Athens. Now, Oedipus seems to have to do with this in some way, because we saw last time that the argument that he uses to show his own innocence, I'd kill anybody who tried to kill me, and I would be just to do so, that argument ultimately undermines the importance of irrational attachments like the attachments that we have just by birth, that we happen to have this parent or this sibling. It is not unimportant that the word genos in Greek, which comes from the verb gignomai, which means to become or to be born, that genos means, on the one hand, offspring, and from that family, and from that clan or tribe, you could say larger family, but also we're familiar with it in English as genus, as in genus and species, so a kind of class or universal category. So it looks as though what's somehow literal in Thebes and in Colonus is going to have to be metaphorical in Athens. So the Colonians, and it turns out the Thebans more obviously than the Colonians because of this powerful autochthony myth in Thebes. We are Thebans because we're all brothers and sisters, because we all are born from the same earth. That in a weird way is taken literally in Thebes. In Athens will have to be understood metaphorically. So what's necessary in order for Theseus to solve his problem is a place to which you can be loyal, but a place that in some sense is not really a place. So a metaphorical place. Now, it's interesting that the grove where Oedipus is at the beginning of the play seems to be that, since it's not Colonus. Colonus is the land nearby. It's not Athens. It will be called the seat of Athens or the support of Athens. It's somehow, we saw last time because of the imagery of the bronze gates, maybe the Golden Gate's the Bronze Road, it's somehow connected to Hades. And Hades is interesting because in Greek, in prose, you'd have, you can't see that, can you? You'd have, this would be Hades. Hades in Greek, ordinary Greek prose. But in poetry, for some reason, I used to know, the rough breathing, which is this, which is their H, becomes a smooth breathing, and it becomes Ides. But Ides, if you capitalize it, if you decapitalize it, and of course they wrote only in capitals, so there's no distinction between any of these words. Ides would be the word, if you divide it here, ides would be a word which just means invisible. So since there's no distinction between capitals and there are no rough breathings or accents at this time in Greek, they really all look like that. So Hades, you know about Hades. Some of you have read the Odyssey, you've read Book 11, you know that that's where Odysseus goes to talk to Agamemnon and Achilles, where Ajax won't talk to him, won't even drink the blood that allows him to talk because he's still angry about having lost the contest for Achilles' armor. What's interesting about that is it gives you a real indication of what Hades is at first glance, since he's talking to all these people. They're called shadows or skiai. You think, oh, it's no different from any place else, except they're dead. They're dead souls. And you say, wait a minute, what does it mean to be a dead soul? Aren't souls, to have a soul, doesn't that mean to be alive? So what is Hades really about? And then you discover that these people can talk to them only when he lets them drink blood. Gives them, I think he cuts the throat of an ox and puts it in a trough and they all drink blood and then they can talk to him. Ajax doesn't do that and stalks away because he is in a way what he is at this point is unchanging and unalterable anger at Odysseus, because his story has been written. That's what it means to be in Hades. Nothing could change. You are simply what you are. You're like a character in a movie. So we have these movies like, what's the name of Woody Allen's movie? When the character comes off the stage, any of you know that? Mia Farrow's in it, she's in the audience, depression movie, she's real down in the dumps, pays to go to a movie when she doesn't have enough money, sits in the audience, and the character comes off the stage and they have a love affair. Or even more recently, the one I really quite love, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Last Action Hero, much underrated movie, where a little boy goes into the movie. But the crucial thing about movies is that they're sort of pretend versions of real life, but nothing ever changes. That's why these movies where people get in and out of the movie are interestingly self-reflexive, because they're thinking about what it means to be a movie. The whole thing about a movie is that it doesn't, no matter how realistic it seems, the character is the character. Same thing about a play. You can't ask where Hamlet went to prep school, right? You don't. He would have gone to prep school, son of a king and all that. You know where he went to college, because but what Hamlet is just what's said about him. You can't speculate, oh, I wonder, what it was like to live in the Hamlet family when Hamlet Sr. was still alive and so on. No, you don't have any interest. They are what they are, and only that. That's what Hades is, and that's why Ajax is such an interesting character in the Odyssey, because to be a skia, a shadow, means that everything has already been written. There's no possibility of any change. Now, why do I go into this? Because the point of aedes is it's meant to be a sort of oxymoron. It's an invisible plays. What on earth is that? Well, it's meant to show you that it is in a way an impossible place. And what the poets do in order to bring it alive is allow you to pretend that it is in a way just like life here, except in some way shadier, dimmer. But it can't be just shadier or dimmer. It has to be altogether different. That's what it would mean. So invisible place is a way of alerting you to the fact that there's something impossible about Hades. When we try to think about the impossible, that's when we write poetry. We make up for an absence by giving it a weird presence, not by, you can't indicate what it is by showing nothing, so you have to show a weird something that points to how uneasy you are about even talking about this thing that defies being talked about or seen. That's where Oedipus, the where that Oedipus is on the doorsill of in the beginning of Oedipus at Colonus. So Hades is the place we are allowed to see, where we're allowed to see all human beings as the same. In Sophocles' Ajax, Ajax is so angry, again, at not having gotten the arms of Achilles, that he decides that he's going to kill the whole Greek army while they're asleep. So Athena, who doesn't want him to do that, blinds him, doesn't blind him, but makes him see the Greek captive herds of cows and so on and so forth as the army. And so he spends a whole evening going out and slaughtering these animals and drags a few of them back into his tent. He thinks they're Menelaus and Agamemnon, who are the kings, and Odysseus, and he tortures them. And then he wakes up and discovers all this dead carrion, and he's a little ashamed of himself. And if Athena hadn't told Odysseus, who was lurking around, what Ajax had in mind, they would know. They just think he'd gone crazy. But they now know that he wanted to kill them. But he shortly after he does this ends up committing suicide. And Odysseus convinces them that they don't want to bury him. And Odysseus says, no, give him a burial. Because there's a qualitative difference between people who are alive and people who die. You don't take out your anger on the dead. With the dead, you acknowledge your common humanity. You're not Theban, you're not Athenian, you're not Colonian, you're just a human being, and you deserve to be treated as that. So what's interesting about Hades is also, since all the distinctive characters that, a character that we have when we're alive is in some way stripped away from us, Hades is the place where we would be allowed to see all human beings as the same. And that this place is the support, the seat, the root of Athens, suggests that, or is pointed to by the fact that Athens is proud of the fact that it will accept any stranger, any xenos. So this seems to be the solution to our puzzle from last time. Remember, we couldn't figure out how Theseus knows that this is Oedipus, this blind man who has come, who isn't named. He just hears that he has to come because they don't know Oedipus's name before they send for Theseus. Turns out that the answer is in a way that it doesn't matter who it is. Oedipus's name, when Theseus will learn of it, but it doesn't matter because any old blind stranger will do, because that's what Theseus needs. Not Oedipus himself, but the stranger. Now, of course, the difficulty is, this is just another version of the problem of Greeks using nakedness as a kind of clothing, distinctive clothing. The difficulty is that Theseus seems to want to make this very openness of Athens distinctive to Athens. But in the end, if this utter openness were actually real, it would be destructive of Athens. Athens would be anywhere, and a city that's anywhere is nowhere. So these issues, this cluster of issues, is somehow connected to two more things distinctive in the play that eventually we'll have to get to. The Oedipus at Colonus is a play about old men. Creon, Oedipus, the chorus, and old men in comparison with the young. Polynices, Eteocles. And it's a play, this is all clear from the second episode, very clear from the second episode, that's about justice, different understandings of justice. We need to sort of work through these issues today. So let's turn to the text on the unlikely chance that anybody wants to ask a question. Let me stop for a minute and take a drink of this. Anything? All right. Let's go back to Theseus's entrance from last time. You remember that we get an elaborate account of how what Oedipus has to do to purify himself. And then, after the elaborate account, the chorus make clear that he actually doesn't have to do it himself. Not his body, we're told. That's what's not necessary. And you remember, this is, depending on which text you're in, line 488 or line 497, for the first time in the play, Soul comes in. As soon as symbolic atonement comes in, Soul comes in. Now then Theseus enters and makes it clear that Oedipus himself is somehow symbolic for all wanderers. And as we saw, it needn't have been Oedipus. Remember, Theseus says, well, you know, I'm just like you. I grew up this way and I had to do this and that, so on and so forth. And so in a way, Theseus makes it clear, you know, I don't need you. I need what you point to. When Theseus leaves, he says, this is after, you know, Creon takes the two girls. No, I'm sorry. After he leaves, before Creon takes the two girls, this is at line 667 or 763, he makes it clear that in his absence, his name will shield Oedipus from any harm. Now later, and most strikingly, we get these pieces of information. So if you look at either line 1019 or 1171, you get this. Except I don't have the right Okay. I want you to lead the way on their, this is Theseus speaking, I want you to lead the way on their tracks, and I must go as your escort. If you have these girls still in my country, you may show them to me yourself. If those who have them are in flight, we may spare our trouble, for we have others to chase them. You get that, which, he says, I'm only going to chase them personally if they're close. If they're far away, I'll send others to do it. And then you get the entire second Stasimon, which starts at either 1044 or 1197. And it makes clear the options for freeing Antigone and Ismene are far away. And yet, when you turn to first line 1117 or 1281, you get this. This is Oedipus saying, but I know well that from none else than you, he's talking to Theseus, my joy in these has come to pass. You it is that saved me, you and no other man. And then shortly after that, we get Theseus saying, this is either line 1122 or 1287, Theseus saying, I have no weight of vexation at that. I would have my life one of distinction, not so much in words, rather by deeds achieved. I let you see that what I swore to you, old man, I have not proved false to, not in anything. For here I come, bringing your girls with me, alive, untouched by all the threats against them, how the fight was won. Why should I boast pointlessly? You yourself from these two will know all. And then if we go back to the previous page, I meant to read at line 1281 or, I don't know. It's Antigone. Here's the man who rescued us. Hear him, Father. He did it all. So shall my telling be brief enough. So you see what's going on? We're told Oedipus is incredibly grateful. Antigone says he did it all by himself, essentially. And Theseus says, oh, no, it was nothing. I don't need to tell you about it. I did it. My deeds are important, but we should go on and talk about other things. But the entire second Stasimon is devoted to showing us that these things happen far away. And Theseus had already said earlier that I'll save them personally if they're close, and if they're far away, I'll send the people who are responsible, for whom I'm responsible. So all of this fits together only if the deed is not the actual freeing of the two sisters, but the decision to free them, the direction. It's only possible if Theseus is solely responsible metaphorically, but not actually. So what characterizes Theseus is an awareness of the metaphorical status of political life. You think about that for the moment. The most powerful metaphors are the ones you don't even realize you're using any longer. But how many times have you thought of? We don't have to jump to the the city or the state. You talk about the college doing things to you. What does that mean? I mean, what is the college is kind of abstraction. The college decided that, what? The college sent, no. Ultimately, even if you get a letter, some person has to have written it in the name of the college, to be sure, but that's the way political associations operate. So it turns out that political life is really a very mysterious thing, because it looks as though it's certainly true that polis, states, they do things in some way, but the way in which they do things has a sort of irrevocably metaphorical character to him, because ultimately it's got to be people acting in a certain way. So there is a certain way in which Theseus' claim here is meant as a kind of symbol of that I did it, I will keep them safe, my name, Oedipus, will keep you safe while I'm gone. The implication being that he takes responsibility for actions which in fact have to be carried out by people other than him. So that's also what it means that Oedipus has been given these elaborate instructions for how to purify himself, and then realizes that he can't do it because he can't see, and he's too old and not strong enough to do it. And they say, oh, no, it's okay. You don't have to do it. You do it, your body doesn't have to do it. And that's the precise moment in which the word soul comes to be used for the first time in the Oedipus at Colonus. So what characterizes Theseus is an awareness of this metaphorical status of political life. And that seems to distinguish him from Creon on the one hand, who takes metaphor literally. He both in this play, but especially in the one we'll read next, the Antigone, he seems to take literally the notion of the king as the father of his people. And it distinguishes Theseus from Oedipus, who rejects the metaphorical altogether, because he's given an argument in his own defense, according to which there are no irrational attachments, and therefore somehow the particular doesn't count for Oedipus. Now, I want to do the same point from, I think, a slightly different angle. The first Stasimon seemed to divide into two parts. A praise of Colonus on the one hand, the first strophic system, praise of Athens on the other hand, the second strophic system. Now there's lots that's interesting there, but I want to look at one thing in particular. So if you look at the first strophe, line 68 or 765, you get this. This is the first strophe. Here are the fairest homesteads of the earth. Here in this country, famed for its horses, stranger, where you have come. Here to Colonus, gleaming white, where the nightingale in constant trilling song cries from beneath the green leaves, where she lives in the wine-dark ivy, and the dark foliage of 10,000 berries, safe from the sun, safe from the wind of every storm, God's place, inviolable, where Dionysus the reveler paces, thronged by the nymphs, his nurses. So that's the first passage. Colonus is praised for its natural beauty and these natural gifts. Then look at the second antistrophe, beginning about line 804 in one text. I forget what it is in the other, but you'll see it. Yet another matter of praise have I for this my mother city, gift of a great God, our land's great boast, that its horse master, colt breaker, master of the sea, son of Kronos, Lord Poseidon, you it is who have set in her that glory. For you are the one who in these roads first established the bit to control the horse, and the oar too, well fitted to the hand, leaps marvelously in the sea, followed by the 100-footed Nereids. Now, so the first strophe, is a praise of Colonus for its natural gifts, among which especially he focuses on horses. And then the second antistrophe is a praise of Athens for its natural gifts, to be sure, but also for the arts that accompany them. So Athens apparently affects some transformation of the natural, and that's what distinguishes it from Colonus. It has good horses, but it's also known for its bits and its oars. Hold on to that. And let's look at Creon's. No, let me take another stop and see if anybody wants to ask anything. You're so compliant, easy. Okay, easy is good. Let's look at Creon. First thing you notice about Creon is how hypocritical he is. Line 738 and 840, we get this. Let's just read a bit. They sent me because it was I who was most concerned because of our relationship to sorrow, most of all within our city for his troubles. Unhappy Oedipus, hear me and come home. All the Cadmean people summon you, and rightly, and most of all do I, in the proportion that I must be the worst of scoundrels if I felt no pain in these your sufferings. I see you an unfortunate wretch, a foreigner, a beggar always, and your sightless journeyings propped up on this one girl only. I could not believe that she could fall to such a depth of misery as this unhappy child here, tending you in your life in daily beggary, young as she is, but with no part in marriage, a ready victim to be seized and raped by anyone. It is a miserable reproach, is it not, that I have cast on you and on me and on all our genos? There is no hiding it. It's plain. But Oedipus, it is you, I beg you, by our fathers, gods, you, listen to my words. It is you should hide it by willingness to come to your own city and to the house that was your father's. Greet this city kindly. Of course, she has deserved it, but your own country should be honored more in justice, for she bred you up at first. So when it suits him, Creon simply forgets why Oedipus is an outcast. He acts as though he's simply willfully wandering around. And the conclusion is especially striking. He says, you owe something to your native city because, after all, Thebes reared you. Whom does he think he's talking to? I mean, how did it rear him? He was just born and it threw him out on a mountain and stabbed him through the ankles. He acts as though Oedipus's case were absolutely normal. He wasn't reared by Thebes, and Creon is certainly not family in any ordinary sense, nor was Jocasta or Laius family in an ordinary sense. So Creon, despite himself, shows how problematic love of country is once you try to pin it down either to land or people, both of which point to particular experiences which will inspire more or less gratitude. So Oedipus, in a way, seems to be the limit case of all of this, because you could say, to the extent to which, you know, you owe loyalty to your country because it bred you, his situation certainly limits that as far as you possibly can. And we have to remember that even when he was king for all those years, they didn't accept him as king because he was a Theban. They accepted him as a king despite the fact that he was not a Theban, and only because he had done them this great service. So their own action sort of belies Creon's. Creon presents Oedipus, presents Thebes as though everything's so natural there. Human beings are like a seed growing out of the ground, and they grow up and turn into flowers, and everything is just wonderful. And that was true of you too, Oedipus, but he just happened to be a seed that was thrown out and then came back by accident, and then nobody even knew that he was a seed and he grew very well, and then they discovered who he was, and then they let him stay for a while, and then they exiled him and he was blind. And it's a very complicated matter of whether he owes anything at all to Thebes, but for Creon, not. Perfectly straightforward. Still, although Oedipus sees this, what's really interesting is that he admits that Creon's speech is just. We're now at line 761 or 863. You would dare anything, from every plea of justice you can extract some means of trickery. So Oedipus, in a way, agrees that loyalty is owed to places and people, to one's philoi, one's friends or kin, but he claims that he's switched loyalty. So if you look at either 775 or 879, you get this. Yet, what pleasure can you have in, this translation has, showing kindness to those that will not welcome it? Literally, what pleasure can you have, or what joy can you have in loving the involuntary? The literal translation is interesting because that's, of course, precisely what kinship is, what philia is, loving the involuntary, loving something that you didn't choose. So Oedipus is a strange case of a man who, just as in the Oedipus Tyrannus, once again treats the involuntary associations as somehow voluntary, as though he's the cause of them. His being together, his synousia with the people of Colonus, we're told, consists in their eunoia, their goodwill. So a little bit further up the page from where I just read, either 773 or 875, we get this. And now again, when you see this city friendly to my staying, literally, when you see this city having goodwill to my, or eunoia, to my being together with them, my synousia. Now, Creon sees that Oedipus is living a contradiction. Line 800 or 908, who do you think has had the worst of it in this discussion? I in respect to you, or you towards yourself? So on the one hand, Oedipus uses Antigone and Ismene. He expects their loyalty as his daughters. And on the other hand, at the same time, he has made his own filial love, philia, his love that's rooted in kinship, he's made it contingent on good behavior. He's about to curse. First, he doesn't want to meet with his son Polynices, and secondly, he curses him. He's got to do that in order to defend himself from Creon's charges. That is, Laius and Jocasta were parents? I didn't know anyway. So you could say that Oedipus shows here what is useful, what he thinks about himself that will be useful for Theseus. His anti-family argument, family is mere accident, that's what underlies our sense that Oedipus was unfairly treated. And it's the weapon of the polis, the city, against the family. Now, all of this points to why it is that having had his men seize Ismene when she's purified, she's away doing the purification rites for Oedipus. Creon has to seize Antigone as well. He has to seize Antigone because he's not at all sure that Oedipus cares enough about Ismene to use her as leverage. And that has to do with the fact that for Oedipus, kinship is not just automatic, it has to be deserved. It's almost, not quite, but almost as though if some random girl had come up to this blind man and helped him find his way as he was wandering around Greece, she would have been as much his daughter as anybody else would be. So Oedipus has been pushed to this by his sense of the injustice that was done to him. Okay, that's important then, that we come to this question of justice. Creon has a view of justice. It's pretty clear. Line 830 and 943, we get this. What are you about, sir? This is the chorus. I will not take the man, but she is mine. O princes of this country, sir, this is injustice. No, it is just. How can it be just? I take my own. Then Oedipus says, O city of Athens. So for Creon, justice is perfectly clear. It's attachment to what's your own. And immediately after he articulates that, Oedipus appeals to the city, O city of Athens. So for Oedipus at least, it looks as though the city, the polis, Athens, represents an alternative to the notion of justice understood as love of one's own, which is characteristic of the family and of kin, philoi, and then gets translated to love of place, love of one's own land. It looks as though the alternative is what? Look at line either 876 or 1005. Creon says, I'll not hold back my anger, I will bring him away by force, although I am alone and slow with age. Oedipus cries out, you have a bold spirit, sir, to think to come here and do as you do. Yes, I believe I have. If you are right, I will no longer think Athens a city. With a just cause, the weak subdue the strong. Do you hear what he says? But he will not act it, Zeus knows. Zeus maybe knows, not you. The insolence of this, insolence you must put up with. So it looks as though the alternative understanding of justice is an appeal to the gods. In fact, it turns out to be an appeal to force. It is extremely interesting then that in both of your translations, both Green and Lattimore, that they should at this moment have so much trouble translating the Greek word xenos. They both translate it as friend. It's an interesting word. It sometimes is used to mean guest friend, what Paris was to Menelaus when he came to Sparta and stole Helen, the one family connected to another family, so that if you're traveling, you're a stranger, but you're a stranger with a connection. You're a xenos. Literally, it means stranger. In this context, in certain contexts, it means guest friend, and so sometimes in certain contexts, it can sort of slide into meaning friend, but the primary meaning is stranger. So it's interesting that at line 844 and 967, both Green, so this is Antigone, friends, I am dragged away. In the Greek, it's o xenoi, xenoi, strangers, strangers, I am dragged away. The deeper issue here, then, is what it means to be a philos and what it means to be a xenos. Creon's claim against Oedipus is 853, 980. I am certain that what you do to yourself at present is nothing good, nor what you did before, when in the teeth of your philoi, your friends, you yielded to temper. It is your temper which constantly ruins you. Now, on the one hand, this means his parricide, killing the party at the crossroads, but also it means his defense of himself by means of denying the importance of family, by saying that in a way all accidental connections aren't binding. Now, the difference between them comes out still more when Theseus comes back. Theseus comes in, he's willing to interrupt a religious rite to do so for this practical purpose. So line 886 or 1022, Theseus says, "What's this noise about? What has happened here? You have stopped me in my sacrifice to the sea god, Lord of Colonus here. I was at the altar." So he hears the uproar and decides to come in the middle of performing a sacrifice. He also is willing to have his men do the same. We learn a little later, "Here, quickly, one of you go to the altars, urge all the people to leave the sacrifice, and hurry on horseback and on foot at full gallop to that place hereabouts where the two traveled roads combine." That's interesting. "So that the girls won't get across, and I, worsted by violence, become a mockery to my xenos." He then, Theseus, makes a distinction between Creon and Creon's race and land. A little further down the page, he says, "What you have done is a disgrace to me and to your own race and to your country, to your land." In other words, Theseus does to Creon, in order to charge Creon, what Oedipus will do to Oedipus to defend himself. That happens at 960, 1104. Oedipus separates himself from his genos, from his family, from his tribe. "Spirit lost to shame, whom does the insult light on? On you, on me, since both of us are old. Your mouth is wide with taunts against me, murders and incest, and count the calamity which I bore, poor wretch, involuntarily, the god's pleasure. Perhaps they were angry against my people of old. You cannot find in me, taken by myself, an offense to reproach me with of such greatness to occasion such dreadful sins as I committed against me and mine." And the chorus had made a similar distinction between themselves and their land, back at line 822. So the gist of Theseus's claim is that he would not have done, had he been in Thebes, he would never have done what Creon has done here. So he appeals to Creon by appealing to their common status of citizens of any regime. Now, Creon's response is interesting. The first thing he does, line 940 and 1082, is he says, "Of course I did not think this city unmanned, son of Aegeus." So the first thing he does is refer to him by his patronymic. He calls him the son of Aegeus, and so points to the family connection. Then he gives an argument which is sort of like, the once an Englishman, always an Englishman argument. So you're a Theban, you're born a Theban, you're a Theban forever. There's no changing that. You can't will it away. That's why it was perfectly legitimate for me to seize Antigone. And by the way, Theseus, what do you care about a Theban for? Why should you even be concerned with a Theban? The problem here is, of course, he can't help himself. This is the same place where he makes a universal argument about why Oedipus is so undesirable and why Theseus should let him go. So what have we got? We've got three men. All three claim to be acting justly. Creon claims to be acting justly on the basis of love of his own, which is connected to his identification with his family, his genos, which is connected to his identification with his larger group, his genos, his clan or his tribe. Oedipus, who doesn't seem to realize that in defending his crime against his family, he's committing a further crime against the family, the genos, the tribe. Oedipus, for whom justice is utterly cut free from accident, of the accidental. And then Theseus, for whom, the first thing he makes clear is that for him, justice is the rule of law, but justice is the rule of law in particular cities. So the place is particular, but the laws are universal. The place is Athens. The law, say, against murder doesn't specify that it's bad to murder people in Athens. It just says it's bad to murder people. And therefore, it's strange because there is no connection between citizens and place. You could say Athens has become the land of strangers. On the one hand, and then Theseus claims the right of Oedipus to Antigone and Ismene, on the one hand, and of Polynices to speak to Oedipus, on the other hand. But not the right of Creon to claim Oedipus. So people are connected, according to Theseus's apparently rather complicated understanding of justice. They're connected as philoi, father to son, daughters to father, but not as connected with place. So it looks as though Theseus allows for each principle of particularity, place, and people, but independent of the other, not together. So our question ought to be something like this. First question, what does this have to do with the strange ending of the play? His burial in what turns out to be a non-place. You've got, on the one hand, I'm probably to oversimplify it, but there's Creon. Creon's understanding of justice is that place equals people. And then there's Theseus. And Theseus acknowledges the claims of place and the claims of people, but they're not put together. Each is acknowledged, but they're in some way, you could say, the acknowledges the name of the claim of place and the claim of people, but it turns out that place cannot be understood to be identical to people. And then you have Oedipus with this strange view, in a way not so strange, it's much like our view, that justice doesn't have to do with place. It doesn't have to do with people. It's purely universal. So it's almost as though you have an argument for particularity. Remember the praise of Colonus, the praise of the beauty, I don't remember the details, but the wine dark ivy and the rest of it. And then the praise of Athens, which had all that stuff, but in addition to the wine dark ivy and horses, and then Athens that had horses, but also bits. So it turns out that artifice has to in some way be added to something natural and taken for granted. And it looks as though, another way of understanding this is the pure particular, and this is the altogether universal. And then Theseus, and you see why he has to do this, why the play is all about this moment in Athenian history where he has to take the Colonians, who you might say are mindlessly attached to a particular place, and in order to reattach them to Athens, he has to break that thing that Colonus and Thebes share, the sort of mindless attachment. But to break it utterly is to say, well, these particular things don't matter, and in fact, it looks as though what matters then is something like universal principles, which would make sense, and you would say it's not a question of, doing what what people have always done at Colonus. It's a question of doing what's right in principle. The difficulty is that the principle, on this side, you could say you have philoi, friends and kin, and the problem is, on this side, you have xenoi, who are strangers because, in fact, they're not connected in any natural way to one another. And then in the middle, you have Theseus, who needs people in order to break the Colonians from being Colonians. He has to articulate principles of law and justice that are not simply Colonian, but he wants to attach them to Athens, and so he can't go the whole way the way Oedipus goes. This makes you a citizen of the world, and being a citizen of the world is being a citizen of anywhere. Being a citizen of anywhere is being a citizen nowhere. So the difficulty is this middle ground, which looks as though it has to somehow mix together the particular and the universal. And I just point out to you again that that's the character of poetry. That's what it means to say political life. I mean, it's not just what it means. It's one of the things that it means to say. Political life is, in some way, necessarily metaphorical. The city is a poem. You don't want to walk out of here thinking that makes the city somehow ethereal. The whole point is that it makes it concrete in a certain way. Now, one final thing, unrelated, I suppose. in talking about this, at one point talking about genos, I made it clear you could say that Creon's loyalty to the genos. So it's funny, you have one word that could, Oedipus's loyalty to the genos is a loyalty to genos understood as kind, as type, as universal category. Creon's loyalty to genos is a loyalty first to family, and then to the larger family understood as the tribe. And Theseus's problem is somehow how to put those two together. And what's interesting about that is, of course, it's presented here as though the problem is to put things together, as though there could really exist a Thebes, or there could really exist a universal principle. But actually what Sophocles is doing by breaking them apart in this way is trying to show you that they're always together. Political life always has this weird combination of universal and particular. Universal laws, but always in a particular place. Now, in any case, back to the final thing. The final thing was that I noticed when I went back and looked at, I think I first started teaching this play in about 1980. And so almost 40 years ago, I used this word, tribe, to describe what the play is about. And of course, Sophocles used it himself, different language, but essentially 2,500 years ago. So I use this only to point out to you that if you listen to political discourse these days, you'll hear this word tribalism thrown around all the time to discuss features of our everyday life politically. I think it's interesting to see that this problem is a perennial political possibility. And a perennial problem for philosophy. So we find ourselves in the midst of a political argument in which a word is thrown around, and the reason it gets thrown around is in a way, there are moments in our ordinary political life where we discover that almost willy-nilly and without any apparent reason, fundamental principles somehow crop up and show themselves, show that the problem of, that Sophocles' understanding of the problem of tribalism versus universalism, on the one hand, is in a way the perennial problem of political life. And that's what Theseus is dealing with at this moment. That doesn't change anything, it's just, desperate call. Somebody who studies moldy Greek texts and really wants to show you that they're actually relevant in a rather important way when you think them through. The interesting thing is Sophocles pointing out, and then Aristotle some years later in the Poetics pointing out that poetry, when we think, forget about Sophocles for a moment, just think about Aristotle, and this will become absolutely clear as we move through the rest of the Poetics. It looks at times as though, no, let me start over. It's the most natural thing in the world to think that first comes prose and then comes poetry. Poetry is elaborate speech that gussies up ordinary speech and makes it look beautiful. But in interpreting poetry, of course, the goal is to sort of articulate it in ordinary, prosaic terms. There's that line in, which of the Moliere plays is it in, where Monsieur Jourdain wakes up in the morning and realizes that he's actually been speaking prose all his life. It's supposed to be funny in Moliere. But actually, it's rather the case that we wake up, according to Aristotle and here Sophocles, in the morning and realize that we've been speaking poetry our whole lives. Because you think that prose comes first, but in fact, poetry comes first. It's the only way we can manage between these two extremes. So it's not We break the ordinary experience of the world into these two extremes so that we can understand where we are all the time, so that we can see where we are all the time. But it's not as though we construct. Theseus is trying to construct the middle out of the two extreme alternatives. But that's Sophocles' way of showing us that this construction is what's always there, all the time. It is a construction of these two things. You get to see that by analyzing it into it, but you can't. There's a good way to see this. I don't remember whether I've actually used this before, so I was going to say stop me if I have, but you can't. So, in Plato's Phaedo, there's a dialogue where Socrates dies, where he has to take the hemlock and die at the end of his trial and so on. And his students have gathered around him on the last day, and he has just been released from the bonds that bind him. And he's sitting on his couch and rubbing his legs and saying, what a strange thing it is that pleasure and pain are related the way they are, that wherever one is there, the other is not far behind. So it's a Socrates' way of saying that pleasure and pain are necessarily linked with one another. You can't get one without the other. And then he goes on and he says, you know, if Aesop were to make a poem, a story about it, he would have said that some god had suspended them, pleasure and pain, from one head. So there are two parts to this argument. The first part is pleasure and pain are inseparable. The second part, an apparent explanation for it, is that if Aesop were to write a story about it, he'd say they're so inseparable that it must be the case that this powerful godlike force put them together so that they couldn't be pulled apart. But of course, in order for a god to do that, they would have had to exist separately. And so in the act of saying that they can't be separated, you're saying that, in fact, it's perfectly possible to imagine them as separate from one another. So it's interesting in light of the Phaedo, the theme of the Phaedo, which is in a way about the difference between poetry and the philosophy, Socrates, we don't need to go through all of that. But the poetic account is an account that treats them as separate so that it can show what it means for them to be inseparable. So it's for the sake of our understanding something very important, but by the time you get to the end, if it's true that they're inseparable, then the poetic account has to be strangely impossible. That this is a dialogue, the Phaedo, about the relation between life and death proves to be rather interesting. The question being whether, in fact, that's Plato's understanding of the relation between life and death as well. But that's for another time. It's just that the poetic account, poetry, in a way, presents things as having a separate, independent existence in order to show that when you push them, your beginning point was impossible. Well, that's what this is. That Creon is meant to stand for a certain kind of understanding, a kind of innocence and naivete, you could say, that you need to think about in order to understand political life, but it's really very questionable whether anybody is that innocent. So when Anne Lowinger writes her poem about, enough, she writes the poem about the raindrops and so on and so forth, it's certainly the case that when you finally say enough of this enough, because you realize that the act of saying that it's enough is a sign that it isn't enough, that you need to say it. In fact, that's not simply an act of, I mean, you put the problem in this way. What she sees in that poem is that the very experience of the enoughness of the rain falling on the windowsill is already a sign that there's poetry in the world. It's not the case that you have to write the poem, it's that your initial experience of your satisfaction of it, the innocent satisfaction of it, is not, and is never as innocent as you think it is. So there was another example I was going to use, and so this is the example of mimesis from Aristotle. That there's mimicry on the one hand, there's representation on the other. They look like they're different things. They're not different things. They're just different version of a two-ness that necessarily characterizes all human activity. And lo and behold, it's present in political life as well, and that's what the Oedipus is about. You want to ask what the difference is between Polynices and Oedipus. Oedipus wandered away from Thebes. Polynices was exiled. They're both exiled. Oedipus wanders around and ends up in Athens and offers this peculiar gift to Theseus. Polynices goes to Argos explicitly to make new friends and to bring an army against Thebes and regain his kingship. So it looks as though what's characteristic of both Polynices and Antigone is that they don't accept the fact that you can be nowhere. You may be different wheres. You may use somewhere as an alternative to somewhere else, but there's nowhere. You could put it a slightly different way in terms of language, that you can forsake a language, decide to forsake a language, but you have to use a language to forsake the language. So you can't speak language. If you're going to choose to speak French as opposed to English, then you have to do that in French. You can't do it in language. You can't simply transcend language. The apparent transcending is going to be a move from one to another. I think something like that is what's at stake.